King Jaehaerys Targaryen I, also known as Jaehaerys the Conciliator, is traditionally celebrated as the greatest Targaryen monarch, credited with a long reign of peace and prosperity. However, a critical re-examination of his rule reveals that many of his policies created structural weaknesses with severe consequences for his dynasty and his people. This essay will argue that Jaehaerys' legacy is not one of genuine conciliation, but of a reactionary style of governance that prioritized Jaehaerys over his kingdom. This essay will discuss why Jaehaerys was a bad king. Specifically, it will demonstrate how Jaehaerys established governing structures that centralized power to a dangerous degree, cultivated an illusion of peace dependent on his personal authority rather than robust institutions, and failed to resolve serious issues like his succession, thereby ensuring the eventual downfall of the Targaryen dynasty. The reign of Jaehaerys is marked by a pattern of his conflict-avoidant personality, choosing to kick the proverbial can down the road until his problems snowballed into avalanches his successors were unable to address. This essay is structured in 3 parts to deconstruct the myth of the conciliator. The first section will analyze the context of his rise and his first act as king, revealing the vengeful and absolutist core beneath his peaceful mask. The second section will critically re-examine his so-called triumphs, from coercing the faith to his exploitative tax policy, arguing that these were not benevolent reforms, but mechanisms of control that oppressed the people and centralized power. The third and final section will detail his worst failures, culminating in the Great Council of 101 AC, which guaranteed the dynasty's eventual collapse. Before assessing the reign of King Jaehaerys, we must establish a precise definition of terms to avoid devolving into an exchange of inflammatory labels. To that end, we turn to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who provided a clear framework for classifying governments through 2 questions. First, who rules? The one, the few, or the many? And second, in whose interests? The one, the few, or the many? According to this framework, both a monarchy and a tyranny are ruled by a single individual, but a monarch rules in the interests of the governed, while a tyrant rules in his own self-interest. It is with this precise classical definition in mind that we use terms like tyrannical or absolutist and despotic. These are employed as necessary descriptors for specific political conduct, not rhetorical flourishes. When Jaehaerys I's celebrated reign is examined through this lens, his title of wise conciliator becomes untenable, revealing a ruler who systematically subverted institutions to serve his own power, fulfilling the Aristotelian definition of a tyrant. To understand the reactive nature of Jaehaerys' rule, we must first appreciate the precariousness of his ascent. Jaehaerys did not inherit a stable throne through an undisputed line of succession. He was a teenage figurehead, propped up by powerful lords like Rhaegar Baratheon to replace King Maegor. Jaehaerys was the son of King Aenys and Alyssa Targaryen. Aenys was toppled by Maegor the Cruel, forcing the queen widow Alyssa to pay him homage. Distracted by wars with the faith, Maegor kept the other Targaryen children alive. Prince Aegon, son of King Aenys and direct competitor to King Maegor's rule, took refuge in the Westerlands. Aegon's wife, Princess Rhaena, and her children Arya and Rhaella were kept safe at Casterly Rock. While Maegor presided over court in Old Town, Aegon snuck into King's Landing and stole 2 dragons, returned to the Westerlands, and raised 15,000 men. But the rebellion was short-lived. Prince Aegon's army was double enveloped just south of the God's Eye, and the boy was killed by Maegor himself in dragon combat. Critically, however, Maegor chose not to extinguish the line. Aegon's sister Princess Rhaena fled to Fair Isle with their twin daughters Arya and Rhaella. This meant that a viable claim to the throne, now embodied by Rhaena and her children, remained alive and in opposition to Maegor. King Maegor eventually realized the threat posed by Rhaena's claim, and in 46 AC she was forced to marry Maegor to unite the claims. Rhaena's eldest daughter, Princess Arya, was declared King Maegor's lawful heir until he sired a son. This system reflects a succession of male preference primogeniture instead of the Salic system, which had been practiced up to that point, which is something that we will return to later in this essay. In 44 AC, we hear that Jaehaerys was still on Dragonstone as, quote, a prisoner in all but name, with Dowager Queen Visenya, Queen Alyssa, and Alysanne Targaryen. King Maegor got distracted with another war to exterminate the Harroways at Harrenhal, during which Dowager Queen Visenya died, and in the confusion, Queen Alyssa, Jaehaerys, and Alysanne had escaped from Dragonstone with Vermithor and Silverwing. Consequently, Prince Viserys, who had remained as a hostage in the Red Keep, was tortured to death by King Maegor, leaving Jaehaerys the only other living male in the Targaryen line. In 48 AC, Lord Rhaegar Baratheon brought Prince Jaehaerys, then age 14, forward as a figurehead for a rebellion against King Maegor. Due to scandals and black magic outside the scope of this essay, the lords openly started to declare that King Maegor was cursed by the gods, and his rule collapsed. One by one, the major lords of the realm declared for King Jaehaerys, including Queen Rhaena, and at long last, King Maegor was found dead on the Iron Throne. At 14 years old, Jaehaerys Targaryen became king in 48 AC. Finis ab origine pende. The end depends on the beginning. It is said that a king's first act follows him through his reign. For Jaehaerys, whose precarious ascent was propelled by the ambitions of powerful lords and the bloody shadow of Maegor, this was especially true. His initial decisions were his primary tools to secure a fragile rule, and Jaehaerys needed to write a foundational myth that would overwrite the chaos he inherited. Jaehaerys' first autonomous act as king occurred in 48 AC, immediately after Maegor's death. While he technically claimed the throne in open rebellion, that decision belonged more to his regents, Lord Rhaegar Baratheon and Queen Alyssa. However, a critical 2-week window emerged where Jaehaerys held court in King's Landing before their arrival. It was here, free from their direct influence, that the young king exercised his de facto autonomy. With many crises demanding his attention, the most pressing choice was what to do with Maegor's former bannermen, who had remained loyal to the end. Lords Darkland, Staunton, and Towers, the only lords who had remained at the Red Keep until the end, immediately surrendered to Jaehaerys when he arrived. They bent the knee, laid their swords at his feet, and declared for their new king, expecting gratitude or at least clemency for facilitating a peaceful transition. Jaehaerys' response was severe. He rebuked them, stating, quote, "You come late to the feast, and these same blades helped slay my brother Aegon beneath the god's eye." King Jaehaerys ordered all 3 lords, along with many of King Maegor's closest supporters, to be thrown into the black cells. Far from conciliation, Jaehaerys' first act was an impulsive act of retribution. He framed their surrender not as a service, but as active treason against House Targaryen, denying any potential heroism and branding them as late-coming opportunists complicit in the murders of his brothers. This raw, personal act came from Jaehaerys himself, unfiltered by his regents. When Lord Rhaegar and Queen Alyssa finally arrived, they merely institutionalized his initial impulse, seizing hundreds more. Viewing this act through a critical lens reveals an impulsive, self-righteous ruler whose early trauma dictated a long reign of control masked as benevolence. This was not the calculated move of a statesman, but the emotional reaction of a grieving boy who had watched his family being torn apart. Jaehaerys prioritized his personal grief over the good of the realm. Instead of becoming a unifying symbol, Jaehaerys' first impulse was to settle a personal score. Making an example of men who paved your way to the throne and those who voluntarily bent the knee is a spectacular way to disincentivize future enemies from surrendering. Furthermore, the entire realm had been late to the feast. Every great lord in Westeros had, at some point, bowed to Maegor out of fear or pragmatism, including Lord Rhaegar Baratheon. By punishing the very last lords to switch sides, Jaehaerys created a climate of fear and uncertainty. Every lord who had ever served Maegor now had to wonder if they were next. Jaehaerys held these lords to an impossible standard. He framed their loyalty to Maegor as treason, but Maegor was the de facto and de jure king sitting on the Iron Throne, or at least at the time. Lords Darkland, Staunton, and Rosby were fulfilling their fundamental feudal duties when they stood by him. If anything, Jaehaerys had before him three of the least opportunistic lords in the realm. They had honored their oaths regardless of the shifting tides and surrendered honorably when defeated. This was not opportunism, but a stark display of integrity. By punishing the three lords, Jaehaerys declared that their oath to Maegor was invalid, not due to any written law, but because he did not recognize Maegor's legitimacy. He appealed to a higher law, the quote-unquote rightful line of succession, which he embodied. This created an impossible situation for his vassals. How can one be loyal when the definition of rightful changes based on which Targaryen is making the claim? Loyalty was no longer to the institution of the crown or to established law, but to the personal righteousness of the individual claimant. This made every lord's position arbitrary and untenable. What did Jaehaerys expect them to do? Die for King Maegor? The imprisonment of the three lords signaled that Jaehaerys' test of loyalty was based on a personal internal metric that only he understood. This is the behavior of someone who believes his own righteousness is the law. For our analysis, how Jaehaerys arrived at the decision to imprison the lords is more important than whether the lords deserved their imprisonment. His action demonstrates a belief in a higher personal legitimacy that supersedes sworn oaths and positive written codified law. In other words, belief in absolutism. Beginning with this very first act, Jaehaerys' entire reign was dedicated to establishing himself as the sole source of law, a system antithetical to the feudalism established by Aegon the Conqueror. A tyrant like Maegor is obvious. A king like Jaehaerys is far more insidious, because he cloaks his absolute power in the language of justice, wisdom, and reconciliation. Jaehaerys' first act reflects three core flaws of his reign. It was selfish and reactionary, an emotional outburst from a traumatized boy rather than a calculated political move. By establishing that loyalty was to his personal righteousness rather than to the law, he made himself the sole source of legitimacy. From then on, his entire reign became a project to burnish his image as the wise conciliator, a persona designed to justify this radical concentration of power, a project so successful that it has masked these foundational flaws for generations. The legend of Jaehaerys the Conciliator is a masterwork of political branding, a cult of personality painstakingly constructed to mask an absolutist core. This section dismantles that legend by re-examining his greatest triumphs, revealing a ruler who coerced instead of reconciled, and who enforced submission through terror instead of building consensus. The initial conciliation of Jaehaerys' reign was a myth orchestrated by his regents, a peace he merely inherited and later enforced through the same Maegor-like tactics of assassination and dragon-fueled intimidation that cowed the faith into electing a puppet. Ultimately, even his most celebrated domestic policies, such as his tax reforms, were not triumphs of governance, but failures, held up as shining examples of his genius only because the narrative he created allowed for no dissent or critical examination. The peace of Jaehaerys was built entirely around himself, on the quiet tyranny of an accepted fiction to serve the king's ego, not on justice, not on consensus, and not on robust institutions. The Maester's account of Jaehaerys' ascension presents a sudden character shift that serves as the foundational myth of his cult of personality. The Maesters would have us believe that shortly after the arrival of his regents, Queen Alyssa and Lord Rhaegar Baratheon, the vengeful boy who had scorned his late-arriving supporters with "You come late to the feast," abruptly transformed into a merciful sovereign. The narrative claims that Jaehaerys now declared, quote, "Some came to my banners early, some late. Let the rest come now." And that he had to convince his older, experienced regents to embrace this clemency.
Right.
This story is as unlikely as it is politically expedient. A more critical analysis suggests that Jaehaerys' initial impulse had been a catastrophic political error. Lord Rhaegar Baratheon and Queen Alyssa arrived at the Red Keep to find their new king had already dangerously alienated potential supporters. The quote-unquote clemency was likely not Jaehaerys' idea at all, but a necessary course correction imposed by his regents to prevent the realm from immediately fracturing. The Maesters then spun this emergency fix into legendary propaganda. By framing it as Jaehaerys overcoming the vengeful advice of his elders, the narrative creates the conciliator, the wise young king who chose peace over bloodshed, directly contrasting him with Maegor's cruelty. Jaehaerys' first impulse revealed his reactionary nature, and the subsequent clemency reveals the political machinery working to cloak that nature in the garb of temperament. It shows a boyish king who needs his handlers to clean up his mess and credit him for the solution. The treatment of Maegor's Kingsguard provides tyrannical evidence against the myth of the conciliator. All 7 Kingsguard were sentenced to death. 2 appeared to have been killed for their part in the death of Queen Cersei. The remaining 5 were given the choice to die or to spend their lives on the wall. Their crimes were mutually exclusive. 2 were punished for breaking their oaths to protect Maegor, while the other 3 were punished for upholding those same oaths. This was a lose-lose scenario, where the only right choice was to die. This was not justice or law. This was the vengeance of a king demonstrating that his will was the only standard that matters. The political nature of the purge is patently obvious. Jaehaerys needed the lords and their armies, so they were forgiven. The Kingsguard, however, were an expendable symbol of Maegor's reign. Their punishment was a spectacle to demonstrate the new king's power and so-called righteousness without threatening the wider political sentiment. The treatment of the Kingsguard and the impossible paradox created for them is some of the most damning evidence against the myth of the conciliator. If the sin was serving Maegor, then the lords should have died. If the sin was breaking an oath, then the Kingsguard who kept their oath should have been spared. The so-called conciliation of Jaehaerys was selfish and reactionary, a calculated political tool, not a principled stand. Mercy was given only when it was convenient, and withdrawn when a scapegoat was needed. It demonstrates Jaehaerys' lack of principles. He could not apply a consistent standard of what constituted treason. By punishing the Kingsguard for both doing their duty and not doing their duty, Jaehaerys cemented a dangerous new doctrine. Legitimacy flows not from oaths, law, or precedent, but solely from himself. He didn't create a system of laws. He made himself the law. This arbitrary exercise of power, cloaked in the language of justice, is the essence of his cult of personality. Jaehaerys did not conciliate the realm. He terrorized it into submission under a new, arbitrary standard where he alone was the judge of what was right and wrong. The episode of Sir Harold Langward of the Kingsguard further exposes the cult of personality being constructed in real time. The Maesters present 2 contradictory narratives in short succession. First, we're told that Queen Alyssa was careful never to overrule Jaehaerys in public to avoid making him seem weak like his father Aenys. Yet, 2 pages later, we are to believe that she immediately and publicly overruled him on the most visceral point of kingship, which is battle. When Sir Langward demanded a trial by combat, Jaehaerys offered to face him in single combat, only to be overruled publicly by his own mother. The narrative of the Maesters is a puzzling contradiction. We are supposed to believe that Jaehaerys was already a wise conciliator who was, quote, learned as a maester and pious as a septon, end quote. But we are presented with evidence that he was so reckless that he would risk his entire dynasty, freshly secured, in a duel against a seasoned knight over a personal point of honor. And further to that, we are supposed to believe that his mother, who previously valued above all the appearance of Jaehaerys' strength, suddenly found the courage to publicly humiliate him by suggesting that he wasn't skilled enough to win.
Truly, you have a dizzying intellect.
This contradiction resolves itself when we recognize the following. The first story, of Jaehaerys never being contradicted by Alyssa, is propaganda, designed to burnish Jaehaerys' image as a confident, autonomous king. The second story, of the duel, is a clumsy attempt to retroactively attribute to him a moment of mercy and martial confidence by having him generously offer a duel that he was never allowed to fight. In reality, this was likely another instance of his regents stepping in to prevent an impulsive, reactionary boy king from jeopardizing their fragile peace. Jaehaerys' desire to fight was not the act of a confident monarch, but of a weak and insecure one, still lashing out emotionally and seeking to prove his righteousness through personal violence. The king's first act was following him through his reign. He was prioritizing personal vengeance over the stability of the realm. Again, the Langward Incident demonstrates that the real conciliation was being managed by the adults in the room, who were constantly cleaning up the messes created by Jaehaerys' base impulses. The official history of the Maesters celebrates King Jaehaerys as ending the war with the faith without bloodshed. This mythos, however, crumbles under scrutiny, revealing a ruler who simply finished Maegor's work, replacing open brutality with coercion to achieve absolute power. Upon his ascension, Jaehaerys faced a lingering grassroots insurgency of poor fellows led by Septon Moon outside the walls of Old Town. The crown claimed it was imperative to crush this rebellion so that the young king could safely travel to Old Town for his coronation. This premise is a lie. Jaehaerys possessed Vermithor and had already proven his audacity by flying directly into the Red Keep while he believed Maegor and his dragon Balerion still held it. The idea that a ground-based peasant army could threaten a king who could simply fly over them, the same king who had braved Balerion a few weeks ago, is absurd. The threat was manufactured to justify the conflict's abrupt conclusion via the assassination of Septon Moon. The war with the Faith threatened to drag on for years until Septon Moon was abruptly murdered in his tent. The official history suggests a random peasant girl killed him, but the timing is too perfect, and the method, a knife to the throat and highly lethal poison, point to an assassin. The Maesters say that, quote, half the wine still remained in the flagon when the tent was searched, and 4 of the poor fellows shared it as the sun was coming up. All 4 were dead before noon. A medieval peasant is not capable of producing poisons advanced enough to kill 4 grown men in a few hours. The logical conclusion is that Jaehaerys, unable to defeat Moon on the field and weary of a protracted war, did what Maegor would have done. He ordered his death. Where Maegor used Balerion to burn his enemies in the open, Jaehaerys used a knife in the dark. This was not the act of a conciliator seeking an equitable peace, but of a pragmatist taking a shortcut to eliminate a problem. The assassination prioritized Jaehaerys' immediate political needs for a clean coronation over any lasting principled resolution, and it would come to bite him and his successors later on. It is the act of a king who wants a problem to just disappear, not one who wants to do the hard work of coming to an equitable conclusion. A truly conciliatory leader would have offered genuine terms or at least negotiated. Jaehaerys did neither. He opted to just kill the guy. With the rebellion decapitated, Jaehaerys moved to consolidate his victory. At his coronation in late 48 AC, he publicly pardoned Sir Joffrey Doggett, the Red Dog, leader of the warriors' sons. This theatrical mercy was immediately followed by the decree to permanently disarm the Faith militant, further consolidating the power of Jaehaerys. This was the final step in a century-long power struggle. From now on, the crown would hold a monopoly on military, legal, and theological power. The doctrine of exceptionalism that would follow was the icing on the cake, built on the foundation of this disarmament. Yes, Jaehaerys brought peace, but at the cost of subsuming the church under the authority of the state and contributing to the growth of his absolute power. When the rank-and-file poor fellows begged for the same pardon, Jaehaerys did not grant them freedom, instead sending them to the Night's Watch, a lifetime of hard labor at a penal colony. Moreover, no provisions were made to feed or house this horde of new inmates. Lord Stark later told Queen Alysanne that many of these prisoners did in fact die of starvation, and that this was one of the reasons for their rebellion. The so-called mercy of Jaehaerys was mass incarceration, allowing Jaehaerys to maintain the image of mercy while achieving the same permanent removal of his enemies. Later in 54 AC, when the High Septon finally passed, Jaehaerys saw the new opening as a political threat to his personal desire, the doctrine of exceptionalism that justified his incestuous marriage. Ordinarily, the new High Septon was elected internally among the most devout. Jaehaerys subverted this process to ensure his desired outcome. He did not seek to persuade or build consensus within the faith's own institutions. Instead, he flew 2 dragons to Old Town and encamped outside the Starry Sept, a naked show of force that corrupted the election process by silently threatening the faith with total annihilation. Conspiring with Lord Hightower, he rigged the selection of a new High Septon who would be pliable to his demands. By conspiring with Lord Hightower to rig the election, Jaehaerys subverted the institutions of Westeros to serve his selfish desires over the genuine good of the realm. Jaehaerys did not seek to persuade, negotiate, compromise, or build a lasting theological consensus within the faith's own institutions. The subversion of the faith's succession was the calculated maneuver of a tyrant who rules in his own interest. The peace with the faith secured by Jaehaerys was built on the forced capitulation of one party through the threat of annihilation, not on genuine reconciliation. He did not win an argument. He silenced opposition, bypassing and eroding institutional checks and balances. Furthermore, this solution was short-sighted. By strong-arming the faith, Jaehaerys papered over a deep theological rift, ensuring that resentment festered beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of royal weakness to re-emerge. He created a peace entirely dependent on the continued overwhelming power of his dragons, a crutch that, once gone, would leave the dynasty's legitimacy with little footing. The official history, shaped by Jaehaerys' court and perpetuated by maesters benefiting from Targaryen rule, lauds him as the wise conciliator. Interrogating the real politic, the assassination, the mass imprisonment, the rigged election, undermines that clean narrative. Maegor was content to be feared. Jaehaerys needed to be loved while exercising the same absolute power. A true conciliator builds bridges. Jaehaerys burned them and called the ashes peace. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, George R.R. Martin once famously asked what was Aragorn's tax policy, implying that good governance lies in the unglamorous details of administration. He provides his own answer early in the reign of Jaehaerys, whose tax policy reveals a pattern that would define his rule: the centralization of royal authority at the expense of long-term stability and the well-being of the small folk. Yes, I am actually going there. Early in Jaehaerys' reign, the crown was bankrupted by the wars of his predecessor Maegor and the regency's profligate spending, notably Lord Rhaegar Baratheon's extravagant wedding and the construction of the Dragon Pit. The regency's solution was to raise taxes on King's Landing small folk through levies on innkeeps and builders, along with tariffs at the ports of entry. As modern economists might predict, these blanket tariffs stifled economic activity and encouraged evasion to other ports of entry, namely Duskendale, which lacked the tariffs, failing to generate the needed revenue and making existing tax revenues even worse. The crown became insolvent. Work on the Dragon Pit halted, and there were no funds to raise armies against threats in Dorne and the north. Upon seizing power from his regency in late 50 AC, Jaehaerys sacked the old Master of Coin and installed the Pentoshi merchant Rigo Draz as Master of Coin. Draz injected liquidity to the crown through emergency loans with the Iron Bank and its rivals in Tyrosh and Mir, playing the free cities off of each other for favorable rates. With the crown now liquid, Jaehaerys needed a fiscal policy that would ensure long-term solvency without inciting a rebellion. He came up with a three-pronged strategy. First, a tariff on imported luxury goods. Second, a hefty fee for licenses of crenellation. And third, a commitment to fiscal restraint, beginning with a less extravagant royal wedding for himself. This framework was allegedly designed to target the wealthy and protect the small folk. However, this restraint was short-lived. The new revenues proved insufficient for Jaehaerys' own spending, so in 52 AC he instituted a gate tax on all people, carts, and animals entering and exiting King's Landing, a direct tax burden on the small folk and a clear repudiation of his stated principle not to oppress the poor. By 54 AC, fiscal restraint was abandoned entirely when Jaehaerys personally approved one of the largest tourneys in Westerosi history.
'Cause I'm evil.
The core flaw of Jaehaerys' policy, however, lies not merely in its hypocrisy, but in its operation within the feudal framework. The crown's strategy relied on the naive assumption that the lords would absorb this new tax burden. In reality, lords are not the final point of taxation, and new revenues have to come from somewhere. In reality, a lord facing a tax on luxuries or fortifications has a simple choice: reduce his own spending or increase the extraction of wealth from his lands. A self-interested lord would invariably choose the latter, raising rents, demanding more goods in kind, or increasing forced labor known as a corvée. Consequently, the small folk, who never saw a bolt of Mirish silk, ultimately paid for the crown's new revenues. The tax did not hurt the nobility's coffers. It was simply passed down. The small folk have no recourse against this tax burden. Their lord is their judge, jury, and tax collector. The crown's policy could inadvertently empower the worst actors in the realm to further oppress their people. Furthermore, the policy exacerbated geographic inequalities and regional resentments, particularly in the poorer north. While the lords in the rich crownlands, fertile reach, or wealthy westerlands could absorb the costs as marginal losses, lords in poorer regions like the north, the Stormlands, and the Iron Islands have economies that run on thinner margins. Honorable lords like the Starks of Winterfell would face a terrible choice: squeeze their already struggling small folk or defy the crown. This forced wealth extraction sowed deep resentment in the north and the Iron Islands, regions vital to the kingdom's defense. In conclusion, Jaehaerys' tax policy provides a definitive answer to Martin's question. His tax policy was never truly about relieving the small folk, but was a mechanism for centralizing fiscal authority and making the crown solvent. In a medieval society, there is no such thing as a tax that only affects the nobility. Every golden dragon sent to King's Landing was ultimately mined, farmed, or woven by the small folk. The financial suffering of the small folk continued. It was now just filtered through the local lords' accounting books instead of a royal levy. The policy stabilized the crown's finances in the short term, but did nothing to change the exploitative structure of feudal economics, instead reinforcing a system where Jaehaerys' gain was the small folks' loss. In 49 AC, the Regency Council turned to the crucial task of securing a queen and an heir for King Jaehaerys. While many candidates were discussed, the king himself was deliberately excluded from these deliberations. As the chronicles state, Queen Alyssa and Lord Rogar agreed that Jaehaerys, however wise, was, quote, still a boy and ruled by a boy's desires, end quote, which could not be allowed to overrule the good of the realm. Their solution to prevent Jaehaerys from marrying his sister Alysanne was to betroth her to Oren Baratheon, the youngest brother of the Hand. But once the siblings learned of this, they fled to Dragonstone with the Kingsguard. This episode is a case study in Jaehaerys' defining flaws. He did not convene his council to argue his case, or use his growing influence to build a coalition. He didn't engage in political negotiation or kingly command. He instead chose to run away in the night and plunge the realm back into another crisis. He threw a tantrum over a decision he disliked, demonstrating a lack of patience and foresight. Moreover, the event became a cornerstone of the personality cult that would define his reign. In the popular narrative, carefully cultivated by Jaehaerys himself, it was reframed as a grand romance. A dashing young king and his clever sister outwitting the stodgy regents for the sake of true love. This narrative effectively whitewashed a dangerously irresponsible act of state and an act of incest. We must remember that to the people of Westeros, sibling incest is not just eccentric, it's an abominable violation of divine and natural law, a practice that set the Targaryens apart as alien and monstrous. Less than a decade prior, the Faith had mobilized armies of tens of thousands across the realm in a bloody rebellion against both Aenys and Maegor, a war sparked in part by the dynasty's insistence on this exact practice. Yet when Jaehaerys and Alysanne defied this consensus, it was recorded not as a provocation, but immortalized by court chroniclers and bards as the ultimate fairy tale. This sudden, wholesale cultural endorsement is not merely unlikely. It is a total fabrication. The entire realm would not simply abandon a core tenet of its morality because the two teenagers involved were charming. Evidence of persistent disapproval can be seen in the rebellion of the Faith at the Night's Watch in 50 AC and the attempted assassination of Queen Alysanne in Maidenpool in 51 AC. The acceptance of this marriage was not an organic shift in public opinion, but a deliberate, top-down narrative engineered by Jaehaerys himself. The Maesters literally tell us about some of the agents Jaehaerys sent out into the Seven Kingdoms to spread his propaganda. This propaganda campaign orchestrated by Jaehaerys served a critical purpose. By framing his and Alysanne's union as a virtuous storybook romance, he laundered a grotesque taboo into a celebrated song. The uncomfortable truth of incest was buried under a mountain of songs praising their beauty, wisdom, and devotion. The defiance of Jaehaerys sets another precedent of his absolutist reign, of all legitimacy resting with Jaehaerys personally. The defiance equates the king's personal desires with the good of the realm, privileging his immediate whims over long-term stability. Jaehaerys created a model of authority based on personal fiat rather than institutional process or consensus. This test revealed a king who was emotionally impulsive, adverse to the hard work of governance, and a master of manipulating his own image. By Aristotle's classical definition, Jaehaerys' flight with Alysanne was the act of a tyrant. He did not rule for the good of the realm, he ruled for his own desire, and backed it with the threat of force. The theft of 3 dragon eggs by Eliza Farman in 54 AC stands as an indictment of Jaehaerys' negligent and tyrannical style of rule. It was a catastrophic security failure that exposed the brittle foundation of Jaehaerys' power, a cult of personality propped up by dragons, utterly lacking in robust institutions or loyal vassalage. Jaehaerys' entire reign rested not on deep-seated legitimacy, but on the fear of his dragons. He leaned so heavily on this crutch that he failed to build anything of substance beneath it. His subsequent attempt to recover the eggs in 57 AC did not correct this error, and revealed the despotic core of his kingship. The inability of Jaehaerys to manage his own family dynamics, a core duty of any feudal monarch, directly led to a weakening of the dynasty's power and an existential security threat in the form of dragons potentially popping up anywhere in the world. The initial theft was a direct result of Jaehaerys' domestic neglect and poor leadership. It began with what I like to call the Rhaena problem. As a former queen, first to Prince Aegon and later to Maegor, Rhaena's existence was an awkward political problem. Jaehaerys' solution was to ignore her. He first relegated her to Fair Isle, permitting a lavender marriage to a Farman brother to obscure her relationship with Eliza Farman. And when Rhaena overstayed her welcome, Jaehaerys simply moved the entire household, including Eliza, to Dragonstone, where his policy of neglect continued. Isolated and miserable, Rhaena, her lover Eliza, and her daughter Arya grew deeply resentful. Jaehaerys' neglect culminated in crisis when Arya stole away on Balerion, disappearing for a year. The king's inability to account for his own kin and the world's largest dragon made the crown look very weak. Even when Arya returned, only to die in horrific circumstances, Jaehaerys left the tragedy unaddressed, preferring to keep Rhaena out of sight and out of mind. This final blow shattered Rhaena, and she soon lost Eliza as well. Trapped and desperate on Dragonstone, Eliza Farman yearned for adventure, but could secure neither Rhaena's approval nor her financing. For Eliza, the theft of the eggs was thus an act of personal desperation and betrayal against her lover, as much as it was a crime against the crown. It was only in 54 AC, after decades of neglect, and after Eliza Farman had stolen 3 of Dreamfire's dragon eggs from Dragonstone and sold them somewhere in Essos, that Jaehaerys finally responded. But even then the neglect continued. He failed to treat the disappearance of the eggs as a national crisis, choosing instead to hide their disappearance as a secret family matter. Jaehaerys quietly sent agents to Essos to track down Eliza's movements while he dealt with the election of the new High Septon, putting his needs directly ahead of the security of the realm. Eventually, Jaehaerys' agents learned that Eliza had landed in Pentos and made her way to Braavos, where she disappeared. She sold the dragon eggs to the Sea Lord of Braavos, banked the gold with the Iron Bank, took the alias of Alice Westhill, and spent the money building a grand ship. Braavos, then, became the king's next target. In 57 AC, after being appointed the new Hand of the King, Septon Barth was sent to Braavos for talks with the Sea Lord of Braavos. Without stating grievances or indicating any sort of demands, Septon Barth opened by threatening war. A just ruler, operating within a framework of law or feudal obligation, would present a clear case, offering the accused a chance to respond. Instead, Barth's opening was an exercise in intimidation. When the Sea Lord legitimately asked what this was even about, Barth responded condescendingly, quote, "Is that how this must be played? We are speaking of 3 eggs. Need I say more?" This exchange communicates that the Iron Throne felt no need to justify its accusations, articulate demands, or grant the subject city a right to a defense, reducing international relations to the level of a highway robbery. Septon Barth's statements were deliberately couched in the language of fear. Barth began by expressing quote-unquote great admiration for Braavos, specifically noting its bitter history with Valyria and its dragon lords. This framed the subsequent thinly veiled threat of Jaehaerys arriving on Vermithor as a promise of total destruction, consciously invoking the dragon lords that Braavos had fled. In this instance, there is very little to distinguish between Jaehaerys' absolutism and the overt tyranny of Maegor the Cruel. Setting aside the tyranny of Jaehaerys' approach here, it was also strategically foolish. Braavos was Westeros' most powerful trading partner, a naval power, and had bailed Jaehaerys himself out of bankruptcy just a few years earlier. The city was a reliable partner and an indispensable line of credit. A prudent king would have sought to strengthen such a vital relationship. By resorting to dragon-powered intimidation, Jaehaerys sowed deep-seated resentment, reinforcing the despotic image of the Targaryens abroad and demonstrating that the Iron Throne would never be a reliable international partner. With this juvenile outburst, Jaehaerys undermined future diplomacy and created a powerful, silent enemy. Furthermore, this precedent discouraged the development of sophisticated diplomacy, complex alliances, and a robust legal framework for international disputes, in favor of using dragons to solve all of the crown's problems. Jaehaerys established that the foundation of Targaryen power was not justice, but overwhelming force, a lesson that less capable successors would tragically misapply. The Sea Lord, refusing to bow to intimidation, issued a formidable counter-threat by subtly suggesting that he would employ the services of the Faceless Men to kill Jaehaerys' family in retribution. I've replicated the passage here. There are certain things we might do to your king as well, however. Shall I enumerate? Or do you prefer the threat veiled? There is in this city a certain guild, let us say, whose members are very skilled at their chosen profession. They could not destroy King's Landing nor fill its streets with corpses, but they could kill a few. A well-chosen few. The Crown's inability to respond effectively without leaning on their dragons was laid bare. The incident, which began with the demands of submission or annihilation, concluded with a negotiated settlement. Barth returned to Westeros without the dragon eggs, securing only a partial forgiveness of the Crown's debts. A poor return for having permanently alienated a key ally and creditor.
Shit.
This lack of diplomatic skill is echoed across the reign of Jaehaerys. In 58 AC, not long after the Farman Incident, Jaehaerys attempted to mediate a peace treaty between the Prince of Pentos and the Archon of Tyrosh, but diplomacy failed. Even the Maesters admit that the peace treaty was, quote, largely due to the king's veiled hint that Westeros itself might enter the war if an accord was not reached. King Jaehaerys' governance was not built on robust institutions, legitimate statecraft, or deep-seated loyalty. It was built on the brittle foundation of dragon-powered intimidation. This absolutist model proved to be simultaneously overbearing and fragile, a weakness exposed by two pivotal events: the internal theft of dragon eggs by Eliza Farman and the external diplomatic confrontation with Braavos. Put together, these incidents demonstrate that Jaehaerys' power structure was tyrannical in its application, yet incompetent in its substance, capable of bullying the weak, but utterly unprepared to manage serious threats, whether from within his own household or from a peer opponent abroad. The theft of the 3 dragon eggs by Eliza Farman stands as a profound indictment of Jaehaerys' complacent and negligent ruling style. This was a catastrophic security failure that struck at the sole foundation of Targaryen authority. The fact that a courtier could pilfer the dynasty's most precious assets reveals a household in disarray and a king who took his power for granted. Jaehaerys' response was tellingly weak. Rather than treating the theft as a national crisis and launching an overwhelming investigation, he adopted an out-of-sight, out-of-mind policy, compounded by his distraction with the election of new High Septon, an election with which he was concerned for personal reasons. This failure was systemic. Jaehaerys lacked the institutional apparatus, a dedicated intelligence service, secure protocols for guarding the dragons, or a coherent chain of command for such a crisis to handle the threat effectively. His entire system was so reliant on the crutch of dragons that he had failed to build anything substantial beneath it. By kicking the can down the road, Jaehaerys allowed the eggs to be lost to history, thereby permitting the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction on foreign soil. This oversight created a ticking time bomb for his descendants and proved that the conciliator's peace was a fragile illusion, maintained by ignoring looming threats for the sake of present calm. The internal fragility of Jaehaerys' regime was mirrored by its strategic incompetence on the world stage, as revealed by the Braavos Incident of 57 AC and the mediation of 58 AC. When the Sea Lord defied him by sheltering Eliza Farman and the stolen dragon eggs, Jaehaerys' much-celebrated statecraft was absent. The confrontation proved that when stripped of their ultimate weapon, the direct threat of dragon destruction, Jaehaerys' diplomatic skills didn't exist. Jaehaerys had no other cards to play. There were no credible alliances, no effective economic leverage, and no reservoir of genuine diplomatic goodwill to draw upon. The Crown had no real plan for a scenario where its bluff was called. This outcome demonstrates that Jaehaerys' power structure, and indeed tyranny as a concept, is fundamentally unprepared to engage the strong. It can only intimidate the weak, and when intimidation fails, it has nothing left to offer. These internal scandals expose a king negligent towards the security of his realm and his power, while the external scandal reveals a statement incapable of diplomacy. Both together prove that Jaehaerys' rule was not built on wise statecraft. It was built on despotism that was as fragile as it was absolute. Jaehaerys' legacy is a power structure so reliant on fear that it cracked under pressure revealing a kingdom with immense destructive power, but no diplomatic or institutional strength. Prior to 92 AC, the succession of Jaehaerys was secure. Prince Aemon was the heir apparent, approved by the realm and already participating in government and politics. When he was assassinated on Tarth in 92 AC, he had an 18-year-old daughter, Rhaenys, and his wife was pregnant, potentially with a grandson, but there were no males in Aemon's line. King Jaehaerys clarified the heir to the throne by proclaiming Prince Baelon Targaryen, Aemon's younger brother, as his heir. However, Baelon would never become king. In 101 AC, Baelon died of what was likely a ruptured appendix causing peritonitis, described in the autopsy as quote-unquote a burst belly. Consequently, the question of succession was raised again. It was Archmaester Vaegon Targaryen who counseled Jaehaerys to hold the Great Council to peacefully resolve the succession, and so it was decided that the summit would be held at Harrenhal in 101 AC. While we already know that Prince Viserys, Baelon's son, ultimately prevailed, the council considered numerous claimants. The primary contenders were Viserys himself, Laenor and Laena Velaryon, the children of Princess Rhaenys, their mother, Rhaenys, and Archmaester Vaegon. Other bids included those from Serra Targaryen's 3 sons in Volantis, a distant relative claiming descent from Gaemon the Glorious, a master-at-arms alleging that he was Maegor's base-born son, a man claiming to be the son of Jaehaerys, he was arrested, and 3 claimants the historical record leaves unnamed. The anonymity of these last 3 suggests that their claims were deemed non-starters, and a contextual analysis reveals their most likely identities. First, Princess Serra Targaryen was almost certainly one of the unnamed claimants. While her sons actively pressed their own claims, historical language suggests that Serra herself was approached but dismissed her right to the throne. Given Jaehaerys' estrangement from her and the primacy of her son's petitions, the Maesters likely saw little reason to record her redundant and personally fraught claim. Second, Aemma Arryn, wife of Viserys, held a claim of her own as daughter of Princess Daela. However, her claim was weaker than her husband's, and it was likely set aside voluntarily in his favor. For the chroniclers of the council that crowned Viserys, highlighting that the king's own wife had a competing, albeit inferior, claim would have been politically awkward, explaining its omission from the record. The identity of the third claimant is more speculative, but the most plausible candidate in my mind is Prince Daemon Targaryen. As a male line grandson of Jaehaerys and brother to the frontrunner Viserys, he had a legitimate if secondary claim. His bid was likely dismissed almost immediately, both because of his fervent support for his brother's claim and because Viserys' claim was objectively stronger. The obvious and swift dismissal proves a logical reason for the Maesters to omit his name from the record. Other possibilities for the third claimant include Rhaenyra, Princess Rhaella, or another false or spurious claimant similar to the alleged son of Maegor. It was highly unlikely to be Rhaenyra because her mother and father's claims were stronger and they were also both still alive, and she is unmentioned in the Rogue Princess. Meanwhile, Princess Rhaella is implied to be dead by the time of the Grand Council, given her complete absence from any historical records after 73 AC when Rhaena Targaryen died. Given that her line was considered a threat by both Maegor and Jaehaerys, if she had been alive, she ought to have been mentioned. The fact that she was not is circumstantial evidence in favor of Daemon. Therefore, the 3 unnamed candidates were most likely Serra Targaryen, Aemma Arryn, and Daemon Targaryen. For the purposes of this analysis, we will follow the council's lead and focus on the 5 primary contenders: Prince Viserys Targaryen, Laenor Velaryon, Laena Velaryon, Princess Rhaenys, and Archmaester Vaegon. The Great Council of 101 AC was convened to anoint a king, but its participants undoubtedly understood that they were also setting a precedent for the royal succession. The 5 principal claimants each represented a distinct legal framework, forcing the Lords of Westeros to adjudicate between competing philosophies of inheritance. To understand their ultimate decision for Viserys Targaryen, we must first delineate the legal grounds of his rivals. The most radical departure from Westerosi custom was embodied by Prince Vaegon, the Archmaester. His claim invoked a form of the Rota system, a horizontal model of inheritance where the throne passes laterally among an entire generation of brothers before descending to the next. While theoretically ensuring a mature ruler, this system was alien to the Andalic and Targaryen traditions that had shaped the Seven Kingdoms. Its complexity and potential for conflict among countless cousins made it an untenable choice for a realm seeking stability, a fact underscored by Vaegon's own refusal to press his claim, honoring his vows to the Citadel. Princess Rhaenys championed unisex primogeniture, wherein the eldest child, regardless of gender, inherits. Her claim was very straightforward. As the only child of Prince Aemon, Jaehaerys' eldest son and first heir, she was his natural successor. The son of Princess Rhaenys, Laenor Velaryon, represented male preference primogeniture. Under male preference primogeniture, the eldest son and his line take precedence over his siblings and their lines. Within a line, elder sons take precedence over younger sons, but all sons take precedence over daughters. So a woman can only get the throne if she has no living brothers, and none of her brothers have any surviving descendants. Children stand in the place of their deceased ancestors, and senior lines take precedence over junior lines. So the eldest son is the heir, then his eldest son, then his daughter, then once his line is fully extinguished, it goes to the eldest sibling of the eldest son. In other words, Viserys' claim would only be valid after Laenor died. Laenor's supporters argued that as the male descendant of the first son, Laenor's claim superseded that of Viserys, the male descendant of a second son. In their view, the male line of Aemon, which led to Laenor, took precedence over the male line of Baelon, which led to Viserys. The claim of Laenor's younger sister, Laena Velaryon, was the most tenuous. Her claim was redundant. She stood behind her mother Rhaenys in the line for unisex succession, and behind her brother Laenor in the line for male preference succession. Her only independent claim was proximity of blood as Jaehaerys' great-granddaughter, far further removed than the other contenders. Although Laena's candidature was dismissed only for her gender, it should have been dismissed because it lacked a legal basis, representing a bold attempt to jump the queue of succession. Finally, there was Viserys Targaryen, the eventual winner. His claim was the most restrictive, founded on agnatic primogeniture, or, in other words, French Salic law, which entirely excludes females and their descendants from the line of succession until all other male lines have been extinguished. As the eldest living male line descendant of Jaehaerys, Viserys was positioned as the legal heir under this system, bypassing Rhaenys, who was a woman, and Laenor, who was a descendant through a woman. The realm's choice was clear, Viserys and Salic law. The evidence suggests that this choice was consistent with the traditions of the Iron Throne. The succession laws of House Targaryen, while not codified until the Great Council 101 AC, were rooted in a long-standing and consistent tradition of male inheritance. An analysis of the dynasty's history, from its exile on Dragonstone to the ascension of King Viserys, reveals a clear and legally defensible pattern. The inheritance of titles and power operated on a de facto Salic pattern. The precedent was set even before the conquest. Aenar Targaryen was succeeded by his eldest son, Gaemon, not his younger daughter, Daenys, despite her pivotal role in the family's survival. This pattern of male primogeniture continued uninterrupted for generations. When Gaemon Targaryen died, his eldest son, Aegon, became lord, not his younger two daughters. Aegon and Elaena had two sons, Maegor and Aerys. When Lord Maegor died without issue, his brother Aerys succeeded him. The lordship then passed sequentially through Aerys' sons, Aelix, Baelon, and Damian, before reaching Damian's only child, Aerion, a man. Although this might seem like a precedent for the Rota system, the succession passed through Aelix and Baelon because they had no issue. The most telling pre-conquest precedent involves Aerion's children, Visenya, Aegon, and Rhaenys. His eldest child, Visenya, was explicitly bypassed in favor of her younger brother, Aegon, who was named head of House Targaryen. This decision established that Targaryen inheritance was not merely male preference, but was already leaning towards a Salic model, where a younger son took precedence over an elder daughter. This Aegon would later become Aegon the Conqueror, king of the Seven Kingdoms. This principle of Salic inheritance was reinforced with Aegon the Conqueror's succession. Aegon had two sons, Aenys, the elder son, who was born from Rhaenys, the younger sister, and Maegor, the younger son, who was born from the elder sister, Visenya. Despite Maegor being descended from the elder sister, Visenya, Aenys was named heir and succeeded his father. This confirms that what mattered was the patrilineal line. Aegon was the sire, and his firstborn son was his heir, regardless of the seniority of the maternal line. And further to that point, Visenya never contested her brother Aegon's leadership, implicitly accepting this established custom, although she would later advocate for her son Maegor's claim derived from his father. The succession following King Aenys in turn further cemented Salic principles. Upon the death of Aenys, his eldest child, Rhaena, who was a woman, was set aside in favor of the eldest boy, Aegon, her younger brother. After Maegor's usurpation and Aegon's death, the claims of Aegon's surviving daughters, Arya and Rhaella, were again passed over, this time to Jaehaerys himself, the eldest surviving son of Aenys. The fact that Rhaena, like Visenya before her, never pressed her own claim or that of her daughters underscores the strength of this established custom. This tradition was explicitly and decisively affirmed by King Jaehaerys himself. He initially named his firstborn son Aemon as his heir. When Aemon died, the king bypassed Aemon's daughter, Rhaenys, and named his second son, Balon, as the new Prince of Dragonstone. This is not merely male preference. This is clearly Salic law. Under a true male preference system, Rhaenys would have been the heir presumptive after her father's death. Jaehaerys' choice demonstrated that the Iron Throne should pass through the male line, from brother to brother if necessary, before considering any female claims. Under male preference primogeniture, Jaehaerys himself would be considered a usurper. Under male preference, the rightful heirs after his brother Aegon's death were Aegon's direct daughters, Arya and Rhaella. By taking the throne over their claims, Jaehaerys enacted Salic inheritance, receiving no real opposition in doing so, barring the female line entirely in favor of a male relative from the patrilineal line. Therefore, the Great Council of 101 AC formalized a pre-existing, deeply embedded Targaryen tradition instead of inventing a new law. The Council's choice of Viserys was the logical culmination of the Salic principle that had underpinned the dynasty's succession since before the conquest. This tradition also reflected the established male preference custom of the realm. In conclusion, the choice of Viserys was a ratification of existing law. The Lords of Westeros rejected the foreign rota system, the progressive unisex model, and even the nuanced male preference primogeniture. They opted instead for the clarity of Salic law, a system that privileged the purity of the male line above all else. Legally speaking, Viserys was the clear heir to the throne, setting aside all of the ethics and morality of that decision, purely based on the precedent of established customs. Viserys was the clear heir to the throne. Now, one might ask, if Viserys was the legally correct choice, why analyze the Great Council at all? The answer is that the true catastrophe was not the outcome. The true catastrophe was the decision to hold the council in the first place. The Great Council of 101 AC was an act of royal self-sabotage that undermined the foundations of Targaryen authority. For his entire reign, Jaehaerys cultivated an image of the crown as the ultimate, unquestionable source of law and order. He was the conciliator, and his word was law. By throwing the succession to a vote to the lords, he selfishly abdicated his core sovereign responsibility. And his motive was clear: to avoid personal conflict and offload the moral culpability for a difficult decision onto the realm. And in doing so, he transformed the monarchy from a sacred institution guided by divine right and precedent into a political office, its occupant determined by a popularity contest among the most powerful subjects. This set a dangerous precedent. The succession of the crown was now up for debate.
Watch out! Watch out! Watch out!
By establishing that the realm could decide, Jaehaerys introduced the corrosive idea that future claimants could point to the Great Council to challenge succession. Let the realm decide, as it did once before. Jaehaerys' entire reign was a project of absolutism. He unified the kingdom's laws, subdued the faith, and centralized power in the Iron Throne to an unprecedented degree. He operated on the principle that the king's decree was final. He challenged laws, traditions, and customs at his whim because his word was law. This makes his refusal to name an heir an inexplicable and fatal contradiction. If he could unilaterally change inheritance, tax law, and the role of the faith, why could he not simply decree his chosen successor? By not doing so, by using a great council, he chose the worst possible arbiter, the fickle and self-interested will of the nobility. He created a tool that future lords would forever believe they could wield again, permanently weakening the crown for the illusion of short-term peace. The council did not resolve tension. It gave every lord in Westeros a vested, public stake in the outcome. Before the council, the succession was a dispute within the royal family. Afterward, it was a national schism with documented sides. Those who voted for Laenor now had a political interest in seeing Viserys fail, and vice versa. It created a ready-made faction for Rhaenys and her descendants, legitimizing the grievance of the losers and ensuring their estrangement from the crown. In a tragic irony, Jaehaerys, in his quest to extinguish a spark, doused his entire legacy in gasoline. He turned a family quarrel into a national crisis that would simmer, ultimately exploding in the Dance of Dragons. The consequences: the deadliest war in Westeros' history, the extinction of the dragons, and the eventual destruction of his house can be traced directly back to this single catastrophic decision. In the end, Jaehaerys was the author of his house's demise. His absolutism made him unwilling to share power during his reign, yet his cowardice, in the face of a hard choice, forced him to shatter the principle of unquestionable authority at the most critical juncture. He was so terrified of losing the approval of his family that he destroyed his life's work and, ironically, his family itself. The Great Council was a monumental act of self-sabotage. The peace it bought was a mirage paid for by the future. The Council was not a solution. It was the final nail in the coffin. Finis ab origin pendet. The end depends on the beginning. From his very first act as king, the impulsive imprisonment of lords who had surrendered, the pattern was set. The decline of House Targaryen was the inevitable consequence of Jaehaerys' reign. The myth of the conciliator has been dismantled. His reign was defined by 3 fatal flaws: the centralization of power into a cult of personality, the establishment of coercive peace that suppressed conflict instead of resolving it, and conflict-avoidant negligence. These flaws culminated in the catastrophic handling of his succession. Having spent a lifetime enforcing his will as law, Jaehaerys abdicated his ultimate sovereign duty. The Great Council of 101 AC transformed a legal question into a political precedent, legitimizing the notion that the Iron Throne was a prize for the nobility to bestow. He provided the groundwork for the rebellion that would tear his dynasty apart. The magnificent edifice of King Jaehaerys was built on sand, on a foundation of personal whims, suppressed grievances, and deferred crises. The peace he forged was a peace for his lifetime, paid for with the blood of his descendants. The conciliator was a tyrant, the peacemaker a coward, and the architect of a golden age, the author of his house's destruction. And herein lies the tragedy of George R.R. Martin's masterful writing. Beneath the crown of the conciliator was the frightened little boy who had cowered in the shadow of Maegor the Cruel. Jaehaerys witnessed his father's weakness and his uncle's tyranny, and his entire reign was a desperate, terrified reaction to both. He was so determined to avoid being seen as weak like Aenys that he choked the realm with an absolutist grip, while he fled from Maegor's monstrous legacy by avoiding the hard choices that he had to make. He was, to the very end, a well-intentioned but scared young man, trying to build a peace that could not survive him, trying so hard to be loved. And so it is that the end depends on the beginning. Finis ab origine pende.